Your Excellency, Uaeu-Cbe, Cultural Advisor to His Highness the President of the UAE and Chancellor of the UAU, Dr. Khalid Al-Darahami, Chancellor, Vice Chancellor of the UAU, and Dr. Mohammed, Provost. Thank you for your attendance today at this occasion of our first STEPS Forum webinar and at the inauguration of our new premises here in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi. The STEPS Forum was created for the UAE to position itself in the business and government sector of the country as a knowledge partner. It is aimed at addressing topics of relevance to the various communities, where we will be inviting CEOs and distinguished thought leaders on various topics to express their opinion, and in the process to position the UAE as the university of the future. We will be hosting these activities on a monthly basis, and we will be addressing various topics in this regard. Today, we are addressing an interesting topic for me, namely the development paths of two countries that are currently punching well above their weight. You have the UAE that is celebrating its Golden Jubilee this year on the 2nd of December. And if we look at the country where it was in 1971, when Sheikh Zayed put together this wonderful country, and we look at today, the UAE, it is amazing the performance it has delivered and the positioning of the country in various indexes and rankings in the world. In a similar vein, we have Singapore, which celebrated their 50th anniversary in 2015. And the development path of that country has given rise to the saying from third world to first world in one generation. One needs to ask oneself, when you look back at the development paths of these two great countries, why? How? What lessons are there for other developing countries in the world if they were to look at the UAE of today and look back at the start of its creation in 1971, and in a similar vein for that of Singapore. Hence, we are fortunate to have with us today Dr. Sasi Gopalan, who is an assistant professor at the College of Business and Economics, who is from Singapore, and he will be telling us about the Singapore story. After that, we will have Dr. Amani Ilan Shansai, who is also a professor at the College of Business and Economics, that will then address the development path, the development journey of the UAE, whereafter we will then have 20 minutes on Q&A to answer questions that panel, that the registered people might have, the audience that have. We have a large online audience, and I have a few questions for them myself. We are fortunate to have two people that are knowledgeable on the topics that we will be addressing today. So I think without further ado, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I will be asking Dr. Sasi then to talk to us on the Singapore story. Dr. Sasi, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Dignitaries here, His Excellency, our respected Chancellor, respected Vice Chancellor, and our Provost of the University, and Dean Professor Mahdi of College of Business and Economics, and my dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, a very good morning, and I would like to say my thanks to Johan and his team for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts about the Singapore's transformative experience since 1965. Right, now, before I begin, just would like to start with a very simple message that, which, if you want to call it, it's the punchline of the presentation, right? Which I hope to communicate through in the next 20 minutes or so. What Singapore did since 1965 was literally creating something out of nothing. And this did not happen because of magic. It happened because of effective public policy, which was driven and led by very capable leaders who were visionaries, and they were able to implement it in a very fearless fashion. That the decisive leadership and the role they played in implementing this public policy was what shaped Singapore's experience over the last 50 years. Now, as you all might be familiar with the Singapore story, it starts with the founding father, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, a trained lawyer, and he was also the first prime minister of Singapore. And there are so many leaders who contributed, but two of them deserve a very significant mention. So one is, of course, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and the other one is Dr. Uaeu-Cbe, who was or who is still considered as the economic architect of the modern Singapore, especially because there was a neat division between the two of them. While Mr. LKY would be dealing with the politics and the social issues, the economics of it was run and was facilitated by the brains of Dr. Uaeu-Cbe. So these two people, in addition to a very capable team of leaders, they made sure that Singapore's remained a transformed country, and it set on a path of very impressive transformation. So now, in the words of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew himself, he wrote a very compelling book. If you are interested in the story of Singapore, all this that I'm trying to say is all well established, documented in both academic and policy research, and it's not my perspective or opinion. And one of the first resources that we should be looking at is Lee Kuan Yew's book himself, and what he wrote. Now, when he started out in 1965, Singapore was, it was almost nothing, and there was a lot of uncertainty about how this country is going to survive in this big bad world at that point in time, and there was no clear direction as to how they were going to move forward. And thanks to his visionary leadership and Dr. Uaeu-Cbe's policies, they were able to, build together, forge a path, which became the envy of the world eventually. Right. So now, one of the architects, Dr. Uaeu-Cbe, had very positive feelings about what Singapore could achieve, given what they had at that point. No natural resources, nothing to really begin with. So we really can bank on the literacy of the population. We have an enlightened labor force, and we are going to use this to our advantage. We are going to bank on our political stability, and we are going to make this an attractive place for others to come and do business and come and live here and build this country together. This was like the pioneering thought that started to put Singapore in that path of development. Right now, it looked like that, then literally empty, nothing there. And now we know how Singapore looks. If you all have paid a visit to Singapore, you know how the skyline looks, and this is part of what you see today. And it's not an exaggerated photo. This is literally what you will see if you visit the country. Now, how did this happen? Where did it start, and how exactly did they go ahead with this? Now, before I talk about specific policies, let me just, for motivation, present some macroeconomic numbers, given that it's useful to set the tone about how the country has performed over time. Just a few slides, just talking about the growth story. Now, the first, we know that between 1965 until the pandemic hit, Singapore's growth rate was about 7.5% on average compared to the OECD economies. And even the world average was about 3.5% or so. So it has definitely been posting stellar economic growth rates. It's also managed to have an outstanding per capita GDP because of what it has done, because of the rapid growth of GDP that it has had. And it has surpassed many, many developed countries over a period of time. Well, none of this growth has come at the expense of volatility. None of this has happened at the expense of inflation. For a very small open economy like Singapore, it is always important to have macro stability. And if you don't have stability, especially if you are not holding on to inflation and you don't manage to keep prices under check, it is going to have a problem. And for a small open economy, that threat was always there, but they have managed pretty comfortably over the last few decades, or the last 50 years or so. If you compare their numbers, they are very enviable, right? Now, how did this happen, right? So that's just the macro story. So now, how did they come about doing this? Right? Well, no one owes us a living. One of the famous things that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew talked about when in those days, we have to be presenting a united force, and we have to make sure that we are always competitive and staying ahead of the game. And if we don't do that, there is no place for us in this world. And that is how clear-headed he was at that point in time. And in his own words, if you look at what he clarifies as his two-pronged strategy for putting Singapore on this path of development, he said there were two things essentially he envisioned. One, if we have a very hostile region around us, where people don't want to deal with us, then let's leapfrog the region, let's engage with the Western world, let's link up with the developed world and attract their manufacturers to come to Singapore and export their products from here to the rest of the world. We will create an infrastructure for them to come and make this place a glorifiable place, rather than worrying about the fact that our neighbors are not being very friendly to us at that point, in the 60s. Second, what he called as we will create a first world oasis. Well, what he meant was, let's transfer all the first world standards to Singapore. If you think about security, health, education, transportation, infrastructure, services, we will provide all of that here. We will build it. If we are only as good as our neighbors, nobody would want to come here. So we have to stand out, and we have to show that this is a place where you can all come and do better. And so that's exactly what his vision was. And that's how he started out this entire journey. If you want to actually provide a framework, right now, there is a lot of narrative about how you can understand Singapore's development path. But a very compelling narrative that I have found comes from a very nice formulation given by Professor Kishore Mehbubani, who was the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He was also a former ambassador, Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations. Now, he said that if you want to understand the speed of development of Singapore, let's look at the acronym MPH. We all know MPH means miles per hour, the speed in a car in our speedometer. But in Singapore's context, stands for three things. M stands for meritocracy, right? Best man for the best job, best woman for the best job. That's not, regardless of your race, origin, religion, where you're coming from, who you are, what your background is. Let's push ahead with the idea that we will consider meritocracy as our prime principle, right? Then let's not get ideological in our policies. Let's have pragmatism rule over our policy formulation. If it is practical today to look at you and learn the best practices, I will take that and I will try to work it. If it doesn't work out for me, I will not be hesitant to abandon it and try something else. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. One of the famous quotes, if I remember, in one of the references was, somebody somewhere has solved this problem. If we have a problem, it's not that we have to come up with an innovative solution to fix it. Somebody in the world has done that. Take a look at what they have done. Read, learn, understand, make it pragmatic. Try and apply that in this context. See if it works. If it doesn't work, don't hesitate, abandon it and move on to the next one and see which one you want to stick to. So pragmatism was inbuilt in all their policies. And I will give you some specific examples of how pragmatism was part of their policy making. And finally, the most difficult one for many developing countries to look up to is honesty. Like, leaders show the way. We are not corrupt. We are going to set an example, and we're going to say that we will be clean. The government will be honest. We are not here to make money. We are here to provide service, and that's world-class service. We will do that. So if I can make sure that these three things and principles are followed, then perhaps there is a future for the country to grow and develop. And this is how he envisioned it. And many, many policies were, you can categorize them under these three categories. Now, this does not mean that they didn't make mistakes. Nobody ever said that. This does not mean they ever said everyone can just follow us and become who we are or what we have done. Everybody has a context and everybody's choice. But at least as a principle, let's try and adapt ourselves, stick to these three foundational values as a society. Probably we have a chance to succeed. Right? This is what how you look at it. Now, how exactly all these three items or aspects of policies played out? Meritocracy, for example, right? It was equality of opportunity. Like I said, you have a lot of people from different races who have migrated. Now, when you became independent, you realize that you are not a homogeneous society. You have Malays, you have Chinese, you have Indians, so you have ethnic Chinese. So how do you deal with these racial tensions? So do not prioritize one over the other. Let's give them all the same set of tools, opportunities. If they make it out to be good, then you come first, then you will be rewarded. If you are not, then you are going to be brutally kicked out of the system because you are inefficient. So they practiced meritocracy in a very, very significant sense, especially in the education system. And they extended it all the way to the politicians, not just to administrators or civil services. Politicians had PhDs and they went to good universities, they studied, they funded their education, they brought them in, said, come to the government, take this as a serious job and do it. We will pay you whatever it takes to keep your talent, but this is what we expect. So meritocracy, and you will see a pathway for you to actually succeed. Right. So this is something that they were trying to, they did it, and it was successful for a very long time, but it ran into some problems of late. And we don't have time for that story right now, but it is useful to keep in mind, but every good policy with good intentions can go wrong at some point. So they also ran into some negative issues because it was promoting a culture of elitism, etc. But they're trying to fix it in every possible sense. But this was one of the cornerstones. Now, pragmatism. I love this word, pragmatism, right? Let's ideologies off the table, right? Whoever you are, whatever your wedded to your ideology is, let's just do what is best at that point. And even if it is completely challenging conventional wisdom, right? So think about what happened in the 1960s. The whole world at that time was moving inward. They were all in economics, as we say, import substituting industrialization policies. They were wanting to be protectionist. But here they say, we will open up, call all the MNCs from the world, whichever ones we think have the potential to contribute to building the country, we will attract FDI. Almost 25 years after they got their independence, it was completely driven by MNCs and FDI-driven growth. And then they moved on to foreign talent. So first, they looked at their foreign companies to come in, set up shops, generate jobs, generate productive capacity, become a hub, become the place where the go-to place. And then we will also open our borders to immigrants, high talent. We will look for talent whoever the best mind, we will bring them in to do these things. So both worked in tandem for them, but this is an example of pragmatic policies that they follow. Now, the remuneration issue was a huge, it created a lot of controversies even to this day. The politicians are some of the highest paid in Singapore, comparable to CEOs of top-notch corporates and top-notch firms and MNCs you can think of. And normally, in many developing countries, if you look at, they will think if you're part of the government or if you're working, you're here to do service. So you are not going to be paid anything. You are sacrificing something to be part of this. But their attitude was different. He said, no, it should not be that way. You will be paid on par with a CEO of a firm because that is the amount of standards I'm going to expect from you as a leader of the country, and you are answerable to the public. So you have to do that. So that is one of those things, the remuneration of political office holders and civil servants to pegging their pay scales to the top private sector jobs was kind of a very controversial, but also a pragmatic policy example. Then their foreign policy was very realistic. no, everyone is a friend. Don't treat anybody hostile. You obviously want, and I can see a lot of parallels to what UAE is doing as I run through this list. But even though I'm not an expert, UAE, I'm new to this country and I'm loving my stay here as much as you can imagine. I can see that this is how most countries should be leading their policies in a pragmatic way. And finally, one last example here is about their industrial relations. They felt that labor strikes and things like that were going to really kill the spirit of the country. So they wanted to establish a partnership between the employer, the employee, and the government, so that we don't run into problems with the strikes and labor shortages, and which will end up actually stalling the progress they have made. So they worked very hard to come up with some kind of tripartite relationships that they talk about, which is still in place actively, and that is something that is worth looking into as a pragmatic policy. Finally, the H, which is the honesty part, the most difficult one to set an example. They have consistently ranked very highly in the Corruption Perception Index as the most clean country around. They have taken a concerted effort to root out corruption at all levels, from the lowest possible level to the highest possible level. Let's not take anything for granted. We will root out wherever the root cause of corruption can possibly come from. And like I mentioned, the remuneration, in developing countries, that is a huge issue. That is why you are essentially inclined to even be corrupt, because you think there is a better payment opportunity by doing you a favor when my job does not pay me enough. But if I raise the opportunity cost of corruption, then probably that means then I would not feel the need to be corrupt in the first place, because I'm already getting paid very well by you. Why do I need to look for favors from you? Right. So that was their attitude. Now, we can go on, but in the interest of time, so I'm going to give you a brief overview of the economics of the MPH. Right. So the MPH is a broader set of principles that guided them across the board or across all disciplines in any policy you take. But specifically focusing on economics, you can easily draw the same MPH example and look for things that they did. For example, your MNCs, they went after FDI. FDI played a very important role, foreign direct investment. Their monetary policy was one of the cornerstones, having an exchange rate centered monetary policy. For a very small open economy, they wanted to have price stability as the ultimate objective. So you can either control your interest rate or your exchange rate. They decided to have an exchange rate centered monetary policy called the band basket crawl regime, BBC regime. And then they were extremely prudent. Fiscal prudence was one of the angles, which is during the COVID days, it actually really helped them to go and help the economy with a lot of stimulus. They were able to do that with much greater flexibility than other economies, because they were fiscally prudent to begin with. They had sovereign wealth funds very successful sovereign wealth funds, and they had ports. Because of the history of the strategic location, that is the only thing that probably they were given, because the location was there, but everything else they had to create and build. And so they established themselves as a port stronghold, and they became a very efficient port. They've developed efficient ports. And finally, the last two H's is about holdings company, which is again using companies like Temasek or government-linked companies to use them for social objectives and contribute to nation building. And finally, they got the housing policy right. They made home ownership a dream. It was not just a dream; they made it a reality for a lot of Singaporeans. It became very affordable, accessible housing, and that is something that we all try in our life. We always want to own a house, and so they made that a possibility, and that was tied to accumulation of wealth, and somehow that housing policy was a resounding success. So that brings me to a wrap. I'm not going to go into the details of this. I know that I had a lot more to say, but let me finish by giving a couple of quick quotes which I found very compelling. Right? If you look at the entire Singapore story, it's not a miracle. It's not magic. It's not something that happened out of nowhere. It was just sensible public policy. That's it. And if you have good leaders who could actually implement it in a fearless way, then you had exactly what you see in the form of development that you have seen over the last 50, 60 years or so. So you absorb the best practices, adapt it to the local context, and fine-tune it if things are not working. Do not always have to reinvent the wheel, right? And the final quote with which I'll end is, the future is as full of promise as it is fraught with uncertainty. So that we have succeeded for all these last 3 decades does not ensure our doing so in the future. So we have a better chance of not failing if we abide by the basic principles that have helped us get this far, right? What are those? Social cohesion through sharing the benefits, equal opportunities for all, and meritocracy, and with the best man and the woman for the job, especially as the leaders in the government. That's your parting thought. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm happy to take any questions later in the Q&A section. Thanks a lot.
So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Your Excellency, the Chancellor of the UAE University, Your Excellency, the Vice Chancellor of the University, the Provost of the UAE University, the Madi, the CBE Dean. Thank you very much for having me. This is a wonderful day today because we have a very special event, the inauguration of our new campus in Abu Dhabi. And in fact, if I want to summarize the essence of the day, basically, it mimics very much the path or the journey that the UAE has taken itself. So the story of the UAE University is very much similar to the journey of the UAE itself. It was created by a visionary leader, the founding father of the UAE, of modern UAE, Sheikh Zayed Rahmahullah. And it transformed into a university of the future. It transformed into a more research-oriented university. It started diversifying its faculty, diversifying its students, and that's basically the essence of the journey of the UAE in general. So when I tried to approach the journey of the UAE, I thought about how to approach this. So the pathway beyond oil towards a sustainable and resilient economy. One layer of or that made the story even more interesting, different than the story of Singapore, is that we have a natural resource. So Dr. Sassi mentioned that Singapore started from nothing, didn't have any resources. The UAE actually, unlike the UAE, that we had massive oil resources by the time that the founding father of modern UAE started his journey to modernize the country. So that added, I would think, I'm an energy economist by training, so I always think in terms of energy economics, that added one layer of complexity, if you will, in the story of development and the path of development in the UAE. So I started thinking about this, approached this by looking rather than chronologically, because we have to always think about this as being a complete journey that interacts and that always it does not have a beginning or an end. It's just systems that are transforming. So that's really, it has a kind of continuous or a continuum of events and changes. So it's a pathway, if you will, of changes in our policymaking. So the strategies have changed, and the strategy, behind the strategy, there is always a vision. So there is a vision that turns into a strategy. The strategy turns into action plans and KPIs and all the stuff that we know. And finally, it ends with some outcomes. So basically, the strategies in the UAE, as I think about the development path of the UAE or journey, I would think about shifts in policy. And the main shifts, so this is how I would like to approach the journey, if you will, and the strategic, basically, economic policy shifts. So we basically shifted from thinking about development by the beginning of, I would start from 1971, the union, the starting of the UAE as a nation, when at that time we were already have joined the OPEC, because when we joined the OPEC, it was just Abu Dhabi that joined the OPEC in 1986, and then by the time we have the union now, we have UAE as part of the OPEC body, or the OPEC. So all the thinking was how to transform our oil and massive oil reserves and oil wealth into development and development of the people. So the thinking, the focal point was basically oil. So oil and how to change this into real development and real development policies. So from development policy to started thinking about accelerated growth and diversification that came later on as a result of many developments. And in fact, I noticed that the shifts in policy and strategies in the UAE have followed not only, of course, the needs of the country as a first, like also it followed the trends in research and trends in the changes that were happening worldwide. So by the time that we started talking about accelerated growth, probably that's when around the 2000s, early 2000s, and that was a translation of the strong development of now they realize that we can have technology as part of the growth story, and therefore we don't have limited growth as they were thinking before. So growth can be unlimited and can always we can use the same resources, combine them differently, aided with the technology, and technology is not something that comes from outside, but rather it is developed within the country. We develop technology and it interacts with everything else. So the idea of unlimited growth, and then we can have basically unlimited wall or ceiling. We don't have a ceiling. We can think and do all the changes. So with that came a change in strategic thinking of the country, and started thinking about growth acceleration and diversification. Then we moved into an era, and that also shows the acceleration rate in policy and in definitely in our lives. So in life, we see how it is accelerating now. So 3 decades of diversification and growth. Then we came to 1 decade almost of sustainable development, when the United Nations and all the world decided that we have to basically introduce the sustainable development goals into all strategies in worldwide. So that was in 2015 only. It wasn't really before that. So almost a decade of sustainable thinking, sustainable development. Then finally, we were in the unfortunate situation we are in, but instead of dwelling into the negativity of the situation as it is a dire situation, the UAE started thinking about resilience and how to come out of this crisis as being a more resilient country, and applying all policies that will put us in place. And in fact, they started paying off. And in that, I must mention again, because I might not have time to go into details in resilience, that part of resilience is basically what we did before. So all we did before paid off at the moment without extra investment. How is there something to do later? Of course, the dynamic part, the response, or the basically going back to normal, or how we can basically bounce back to our path, to our regular path. So we came to building resilience. That became the story here. So this is in general so when it started economic development, the pillar of economic development are definitely eradicating poverty. That was a very founding goal, reducing inequality, creating jobs for national, that led us to the nationalization strategies, so on and so forth. So creating jobs and eradicating unemployment, building capacity, and that's the story again of our institution, the UAE University, building capacity, human capital, and again, as a result of a vision that resulted in early on finding out that the path to transform all the massive oil wealth is basically by building human beings, by building people and investing in people. So basically building capacities, be it education, be it healthcare. We're going to see some numbers now. This is basically the pillars of that. And women inclusion. women inclusion, this is something that I take pride, personal pride actually, of that women inclusion in the labor force and reducing or eliminating basically biases in the workplace and the workforce, so on and so forth. So this is another that has huge economic implications as well, because what we call the labor participation rate for women increased tremendously in the UAE. So that's a dimension of development that reflects basically or summarizes the strength of the economic development phase here. I tried to think chronologically, but again, this is a spectrum, not really something that has a beginning date and an end date, but about the 70s and 90s, these 2 decades, all the focus was how to transform. So this was the question, how to transform the oil wealth into a development journey. Now, how does resources and the vast natural resources come into play here? There is a big research in that area, but basically the time at that time was how can we basically overcome all the drivers that lead to basically a negative impact of resources on institutions, so on and so forth. How can we combat that and how we can come out of that really strong? So that's the piece of difficulty that is different than the case of Singapore. It added a layer of difficulty here. And that's actually, I look at this very positively because despite the resistance, as I call it here now, despite the resistance of transformation and change, because when oil prices are high, we are very tempted to produce more. We are very tempted to use that in our budget, and tying the budget, as we all know, of course, to the oil prices, that's basically kind of a situation that leads to more dependency on oil. And therefore, we tried really to come out of this and to strengthen this as much as possible, so I can take this positively rather than negatively. So basically, the research went into are resources blessing or a curse, or actually we are cursing the blessings? That's my take on that. So we are cursing the blessing. So normally in economics, we think of natural resources as being something that push our frontiers, that makes us having more natural resources and having us more able to produce. So it pushes further. But the idea that maybe it didn't play well in some countries, again, that's something that we need to look at. And research looked at that, tremendous research went into this area, and they came up with 2 things that this is where we are right, or we got it right from the very beginning. Again, not based, I'm sure at the 70s, early 70s, it was not based on research, but a good vision, basically, or a visionary leader at the time. So institutional capital and human capital. So the belief was that the way to develop is basically to build in human and to build in institutions. And that's exactly the story, if I want to summarize the development path of the UAE. Building in institutions and human capital. There is a lot of, again, of research how institutions interact with natural resources and economic growth. Some take the perspective that institutions are an organic body that gets impacted and impact other bodies. Well, that's respectful research. But the other side of the story, probably I subscribe more to this view, that basically both natural resources and institutions started from certain historical backgrounds, started from historical like colonialism in some countries, or we've never been, for example, I believe, occupied physically by other countries. It was Himaya, it was the protection, rather than really being occupied. But other countries were really, in Africa, for example, they were occupied physically by let's say, France, or by the British, or by Holland in South Africa, so on and so forth. So that had an impact. So these origins had an impact on both institutions and resources at the same time. So it's not really a relationship how resources impacts institution, rather than how institutions and resources come together to produce an outcome on development or on growth. Regardless of what we believe is basically we come out with the one conclusion: institutions are fundamental and very important. Human capital as well, healthcare, education, training, R&D also have the same story. There is big research on that. This is, again, probably we all know this graph, how domestic or gross domestic product or income grew over time. And we can see that probably the only negative growth happened when we had a massive slowdown after the first and the second oil shock worldwide. So the US was going into a big recession that extended to the whole world. So these are the lines in the 80s. And then the massive one, the financial crisis in 2008 that hit the whole world. So this is the only two incidences where we see a negative growth. Otherwise, it's a perfectly, so the same story here with GNI, which includes our assets abroad. So this is our income again from our big sovereign wealth fund is included and all that in these figures. So this is even incomes that were achieved abroad. And I see that probably we can see red also here growth in between 2015 and 2017. So that leads me to think that this was coming from the external shock by the slowdown in China and slow oil prices that hit all of a sudden. And of course, all countries were trying to figure out, is it here to stay, or is it just a shock that will take its course and will leave? But it turned out that it is basically a new equilibrium that we live in because of all the changes that are happening in the United States and the changes in the energy spectrum. So this is a very, very important in very good indicators for development literacy rates. So literacy rates came from almost 50% around the 70s, early 70s, and it took this great expansion and it started slowing down, of course, in the 2000s. The reason for that is we're approaching the end. We're approaching 100%. So we're already there. So that's why it started slowing down. But the massive development happened between 75 and 2005. Definitely, that's a big change, and that reflects the investment in human capital. Also, another very important indicator, the human capital, the human development indicator. The beauty of that indicator by the World Bank is because it combines the three dimensions: the longevity and healthy life, not only life, but healthy life, long, healthy life, and knowledge. Knowledge includes education and other uses of or developments in knowledge, and also a standard of living or income. So three-dimensional, and we can see how it is basically increasing. The one thing that I would like to stop at to emphasize that the whole world was never the same after the 2008 crisis. If you notice the small change, we call this a structural change in the data. So in 2008, we will notice that we are moving to a lower trajectory. The reason for that is the massive shock, and this is emphasizes the importance of basically policies that macroeconomic policies that will basically safeguard against something like this. However, the whole world was facing something like this, but this is for what is coming next, because we haven't seen the numbers post COVID. So this is lesson for us to basically work on for the post-COVID era, so we don't have another slide in our trajectory for human capital indicators. So this is a fantastic, of course, achievement, because it's approaching 1, and 1 is the maximum. So this is a wonderful achievement. And actually, we are the 31st worldwide among 200 plus countries, 220 or 30, 230 countries. That's in 2019. That again emphasizes the governance indicators here because institutions, again, not only education and health, but also governance. We see how government effectiveness, we take a big pass on that, big applause for government effectiveness that is approaching almost 100. And this is probably the best indicator among all of them. But the rest are fairly good as well. And we are making progress as from 2009 to 2019, we can see all the bars increasing. So in regulatory quality, in rule of law, corruption, control. So basically the best are government effectiveness and control of corruption. These are the best achievements, and the others are very well or very good, but maybe more work needed there. This is a very important also index. This is a property rights index. Property rights is a big story here because if I don't respect intellectual property rights, and I respect the appropriation of capital and all that, there is no direct foreign direct investment. So foreign direct investment is completely related and inflows are completely related. That's big research done there related to property rights. Again, we see big improvements in property rights protection in the UAE, and that's we are the 21st worldwide. That's a startling basically position. Among more than 200 countries. So healthcare. Healthcare, I should warn you against this graph because it basically looks at healthcare spending and public healthcare spending. Of course, it has an ideological aspect. In other words, some countries do this through public spending. Some countries like the US, for example, they are talking about repealing and replacing Obamacare. So they don't like the idea that probably the public sector is paying for healthcare. So it's an ideological thing. We cannot really take it in comparative sense between countries. Like what I care about or what I really care about is the trend, and the trend definitely is increasing. And there is research also that says that if we have low public spending per capita on health and we have low human development index, then chances are that the healthcare system will be really curtailed and will be really crumbling. So this is again research that has been done in this area. So we are doing well also in terms of healthcare. How did this play? Because I learned this lesson a long time ago that I don't look at the feeding variable. The feeding variable is the spending. So we spend for outcome. So I look at the outcome. So looking at the outcome is more effective here. And the outcome was, this is before COVID. So I meant that this stops before COVID because that gives me an indicator also of our current resilience to this crisis. So we see hospitals increasing between the 70 and 2015 from 7 to 126 hospital beds per one person in the population is tremendously improving. Physicians also are taking population growth into account. Also per one person in the economy is definitely increasing. I looked at health centers. That's a massive increase in health centers from 21 health center UAE wide in 1970 to 4,352 basically in before COVID. So that's a great. Nurses the same trend, the physicians the same trend. So that showed basically where we are in the real aspect of it. What was the impact or the result? So we have a feeding variable, we have an outcome, then we have the final result of that of these achievements. So the final results, alhamdulillah, I say this really, if I add the United States probably we needed to go, we will break the roof. So alhamdulillah, and we, really from my very bottom of my heart, I say alhamdulillah, 1 million times are not enough. So we have this very low percentage of death as compared to other countries. That is not also by chance, as Dr. Sassi indicated in the case of Singapore. That's good policy. That's good public policy. That we are prepared for such crises. Countries like the United States were not prepared for such crises enough. We're not prepared enough. So we we take pride actually in, we take pride humbly, alhamdulillah, that we are doing far better than other countries worldwide. But this is again a vision and application of good public policy. Then we moved into an era of accelerated growth and diversification. The story about diversification is very big. The problem with diversification in resource countries takes another dimension because there is always resistance to diversification. As I mentioned, because of the budget, we have budget needs. So we want to diversify, but if we diversify, how can we fund the diversification itself? So that's the catch-22. I will skip this one. So this is the catch-22 I'm talking about, that we want to diversify, and in order to diversify, we need resources. So resources are coming from oil. So you want to diversify away from oil, but you're using the oil resources to diversify. So that creates here the situation where it becomes more complex. But in more complex situation, when we come out winners, that's the story and the beauty of that. So basically, there is massive research again into which countries were able to diversify and diversify well by taking either the diversification in terms of products or export, the number of exports, and in terms of the number also the value added of that export, the value added chain or the value chain of that. So is it complex? Is it simple products? In terms of resource countries, when they looked at emerging economies with resources, the countries that already had good diversification or a good stage of diversification, and I believe we belong to this category, were able to use their resources to further diversify into complex. So that's research. That's, in fact, it's panel research. So many countries and so many years proved that when I diversify more, I get quality diversification at the end. So more diversification, despite all the difficulties, leads to quality diversification. So that's the policy insight here. Commodity, those who are focused on commodities did not have this result. So there was no result. Resistance to diversification is a big issue, but luckily the research showed us the way, showed us which countries can basically overcome this resistance. And this is one of the very important studies. I believe this was his PhD thesis that turned into so many papers and a book actually by Dunning, that he identified the trade-offs. He said there is when you let resources, there is a trade-off. One trade-off is that you are gaining the diversification, economic diversification values and improvements. So the economic positive benefits. On the other hand, you are letting go from a political perspective, a very important, the energy gives power, power worldwide, power on the realm of international economy, power even inside on the national level. So basically, I have to let go my power in order to gain economic gains. That's not easy. To make this decision and to get it to be bold enough to get into this needs a lot of public support. So he identified factors that would lead to that. So he said when oil and oil exporting and other natural resource countries face this situation of volatility, of that their plans are disrupted because of the volatility of oil or other resource prices, they become fed up with that. And they want to do it differently. That's one dimension. The other dimension is that the oil market itself is changing and the dynamics are different and the fundamentals now are changing and the movement in oil prices are basically now we are facing a new low oil prices. So that's another factor. And of course, the environmental aspects that we have to go green is a third situation that led the UAE basically into a situation where we have to diversify into green diversification rather than just diversification. And finally, the support of the public elite. So unless the ruling elite are supporting this initiative of letting go the power of oil and the energy in order to diversify, and they get the gain, and they have the boldness of doing so, and they have the public support needed for that, probably there will be high resistance. So I see the UAE actually benefited from the support for the leaders and the economic stability and the political stability, and really did this, came ahead of this diversification resistance. So we started actually winning the game, and that's the beauty of it. So yes, there is resistance, of course. This is in all resource countries. However, we came basically ahead of the game. The economic diversification in the UAE had, I don't want to tip over time. So the economic diversification model basically was based on this prominent, Gelb is a prominent World Bank professor of economics. And he was talking about creating competitiveness and agglomeration externalities, where we have this, let's say, internet city, when we have these clusters, and they start basically having this spillover effects on all the other positive spillover effects on all other aspects of life, in terms of modernization, in terms of technology, in terms of better quality of management, so on and so forth. So this is the model, plus creating competitiveness. I will skip this and come back to it. Where are we on competitiveness? This is where we are. We are the 9th. In fact, the 9th twice in 2 consecutive years. This is the post-COVID situation. So this post-COVID. The one was before was the 9th as well, the year before, which gives me actually, I was very happy to see this, because it means that the crisis, the big crisis that the whole world is going through, did not impact our competitiveness in the world. And competitiveness has lots of course, layers. It's not just an empty word. It has a lot of work done in this direction. So what was the model? Again, in diversification, attracting foreign direct investment, strengthening governance and competitiveness. We already saw the indicators. I will show you now the direct foreign investment, large modern infrastructure, investing in human capital, open trade, and there is also work that has been done how openness positively impacted the UAE growth and diversification, and that's also shown in research. So our open door policy was really paying off in terms of better growth and better diversification, and then becoming a global tax haven in the positive meaning of the word, not in the negative term. Like to become basically a place where people find the lower taxes, capital can come without being bothered by the appropriation of their returns, so on and so forth, and low red tape, of course. I would add to this not only low taxes, but low red tape, low regulations that will hinder their progress. This is the result. The result is that we are now having less a percentage of oil rents as a percentage of GDP. So now it hovers around 30% of the economy. However, economists are con artists usually. So I can present the number and I can present the same number in a different way to convince you otherwise. And that's exactly what I did in recent research, that I showed that probably we are 30%, but how about if the 70% is dependent on that 30%? So that was the question we raised in this paper here. And the answer, the outcome that we had in this research was that basically the industry is the one that is quite linked to oil. The service sector is the answer. So services are the one to be focused on because they are less prone to shocks, because they are basically are more resilient to external shocks. So foreign direct investment, we see a massive increase, and that's a result of the diversification that happened before the 2000s. And then again, this is the impact of the crisis. It went down to 2008, and then it started recovering as a result of the improvements, as I said, in all the indicators of governance, all the property rights improvements. This is to show that the UAE, in fact, lower the better. So to show that the UAE was well positioned This is before 2010. An average of the years before 2010 was very well positioned actually to sustain the crisis we are in now. Why is that? And to diversify. Why is that? Because in a combination of exports of oil to total exports and also the budget dependence on oil, these two combined here places the UAE at a lower position, meaning we are less dependent on basically the oil. So I will skip basically and go to my takeaways. That's what I guess, that I will miss the resilience, but my slides are there for the interested reader. But again, it shows the message that we were well equipped basically to face this crisis. But of course, we need to face what is coming next. Major takeaways, the UAE succeeded in transforming its massive oil wealth into welfare gains to its population. Public policy shifted from development to accelerated growth to sustainable development to building resilience. Institutions and governance and human development qualities played an important role, in fact, the crucial role in such transformation. The COVID crisis is accelerating the digital transformation. I still remember when we had to go online in one day, and we did it. We did it because if I went through my slides, when I read the numbers that came from the CETL, I realized that this is a mitigation number. Mitigating the crisis because of all the developments that were made in technology in the UAE. So if we look at the total lectures that we could have lost versus what was restored, it was more than 90% in over 2 nights. We all became experts in technology, and we all did it, all my colleagues. So basically, we were able to restore the educational crisis by almost 90%, and that's a great achievement. So that's an example of mitigation investments that you do in the past or make in the past in order to prevent a crisis in the future. So technology, digital transformation, definitely. We moved from the concept of smart cities to the concept of smart nations now. Education and reskilling are critically important for successful and sustainable digital transformation. Finally, the digital transformation can help also achieving the sustainable development goals. They are very much linked. By that, I thank you all for listening and for your valuable time. And thank you very much for having me, and enjoy the day. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amani. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move into the Q&A session. I have a couple of questions. That's for you. If you can just, Sasi, you have over there. Question and email from Dr. Muhammad Al-Kuwaiti from the Health and Medical College. Very interesting one. He says he agrees with us from the third to first world country in one generation, probably in what we see, visually, feel, and taste. And then he asks, do you think there is a delay in the optimization of ethical values overall that first world countries took many generations to comprehend and improve and change? And together with that, do most individuals in the UAE cherish and protect these values? I mean, I think that I'm going to victimize you on that one.
Yes, I'm trying to think deeply about that because it's a socio-economic, it's more of a social, socio-economic question. Ethical values, of course, were disrupted. That's my personal view. I haven't done any research or read into these ideas, but definitely we had a disruption of that because it became now a war of existence. So we saw this in the vaccines, for example. So vaccines, every country wants to grab the vaccines for other countries, and we decide to go into third and fourth shots. I'm going into my fourth shot tomorrow. So we see this, and actually there are countries, poor countries, that are not even able to have the first shot. So yes, ethics, I can say that of course, years of building of ethical values and even business ethics, I would think now in terms of business. So business ethics were disrupted also by this because because it's again war of existence. So when you have to do everything to exist in this difficult times. Right. But I think this disruption, we are hoping, we don't have any research to confirm that. We are hoping that we will be able to basically sustain this crisis and move ahead.
Well, indeed, I think you referred to it when you spoke about the tax haven, but from a positive perspective. So you did touch upon that. Now, I always teased when I was in Singapore, the Singaporeans, that the only reason why they knew something like corruption is because they were computer literate and could Google the word. But there's something, the security, and it's one of my questions that I have, is that the security, the law, the levels of law abide, the levels to which people are law abiding, let's put it this way, for me in both countries have been astonishing. As a father of two daughters, it is something which I am absolutely grateful about. You know, depends on, it doesn't, let's put it this way, it doesn't depend on what time of the day and where you walk or not walk, you are safe and secure. There's another question that I have. Is there any necessary, cultural, socioeconomic, historical, etc., that are needed for such one-generation transformations, such as the one that we have now seen both in Singapore and here in the UAE? Any cultural, socioeconomic, historical factors? So from those two countries, what lessons can we then pass on to other developing countries in the world?
That's a good question, very good question. Definitely part of our culture, I must say, is coming from the Islamic culture, and we adhere to that very much. So still, we are more the philanthropy aspect of probably economic policies, so on and so forth. Is but if you are talking about certain historical. So what can we pass to current generations, or you mean as nations?
Well, as nations and as generations, because it's about taking what has happened in the past, the good of the past, yes, and projecting into the future. The contexts are different. If you go back to 1965, the world was a totally different place than it is today. So from a historical perspective, what can we take with us, bearing in mind that the context has changed and is changing? You spoke about the impact of technology, the digital world, something which the UAE and Singapore both have embraced very strongly. So, you know, how do we take that forward?
Okay, thank you again for that question. I would think that from Singapore's experience, strictly speaking from Singapore's experience as an observer of what has happened, culturally, I mean, I don't think the prerequisites were needed on all those fronts. Like you talked about, even if you have nothing, you can still do something if you have the political will. I think political will is what I will boil it down to. I mean, think about, as an example, what they did with corruption. Right? I mean, you're talking about rule of law, you're talking about institutions. There's so many, Dr. Bani's presentation, I was taking notes like a student, which I still do. And I think there were so many commonalities between the UAE's journey and Singapore's journey in terms of all the items that you had mentioned: human capital emphasis, world governance indicators, labor force participation, property rights, FDI, open door policies. All these were items that I had mentioned. And the key common denominator for all these items is the political will to run through with it, right? I mean, if you want to suddenly wake up today and decide that this country will be a corrupt-free country, I mean, not here, but this is already one. But I'm saying, a developing country wants to emulate a Singapore model, then they have to ask themselves the question that even if we don't have the resources to do that, do we have the willpower to actually stick our neck out and make sure I can actually reprimand the highest authority in my political circles to actually take him to task for behaving in a corrupt way? And that's exactly what I think. There were several high-profile cases in Singapore where leaders were named and shamed, and you know, they for being corrupt. And I think so. If you're going back to that, tying it back to that question, I feel that so even if you have nothing of the list that you had read, I think if you have the political will, that can be implemented. And I think, and also when you deliver it on the economic progress, when people see jobs, when people see income, when people see their upward mobility, then they are obviously more inclined to trust the leaders that their policies are working for us. And that is exactly the confidence that you need to have, instilled in the minds of the public. And that's how I look at it, if that answers the question.
No, definitely. Thanks, Dr. Sasi. Question that I got from Steve Krantz from the UAEU. He says that it seems to him that both countries were able to grow quickly based on the hub and spoke model, and that investments in ports and infrastructure were key to development. Any comments?
Yes, that's absolutely true. Of course, the investment and infrastructure were of the pillars that basically were key to start this trajectory of. We saw that the flows of capital started basically accelerating after the 2000s. This is because all the infrastructure that have been put in place before that, and all the actually the laws and the regulations and the regulatory framework that have been put in place, so that allowed basically this massive increase in inflows of capital. So yes, I would agree with this very much. Yes, investment and especially in infrastructure were a big factor in the development and in the accelerated growth. Yes.
I completely agree. I think the obsession with infrastructure, if I may call it, if you have been to Singapore, and the fact that it is a KPI-driven model, like key performance indicator, that is all over your face. And I think whenever you're there, you really feel that the trains have to run on time, the buses have to come at 4:14 exactly at the 35th second. If it doesn't come, you're fine. That sort of an obsession is what probably got them. I'm not saying that it worked perfectly. There are imperfections that they themselves admit, and there have been issues that they are trying to tackle. But as a philosophy, the idea that both countries have taken to heart the importance of infrastructure spending is absolutely right on the ball. And that is what most countries would want to get there. And Singapore's only advantage, like you mentioned, oil or natural resource to UAE, the strategic location of where it was the geography was the only thing that they had to their benefit when they started out. So they had to make it an entrepreneur trade. They had to play to their strengths by building the port infrastructure, right? And so that was absolutely fundamental to their story.
I always say that the most important resource Singapore had, in addition to its geography, is the 6 inches between the ears of their people, because they had no other resource, and they're doing exceptionally well. And in the UAE, the focus on education, as is the case in Singapore, is again aiming at developing this extremely important resource, which is your main competitive advantage. Dr. Urvat Tariq of the UAE, you also asked the question, and it's quite a difficult one. What aspect in the UAE economic system is the country missing out at this moment which we can learn from Singapore, if any? Who's going to be courageous?
Putting me on a spot. I'll go back and I'll take care of him when I go back to the university.
Is there something missing here that is the case that is in Singapore? 30 seconds.
So that needs combined efforts. So yes, thank you for the question. Well, I can think of of improvements like the regulatory system, so on and so forth. But in terms of relevance to from Singapore, that's the part that I am probably not qualified to answer.
No, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I'm not going to wing it because I don't know what is missing here. I have not found anything that is missing here yet, to be very honest. But maybe I will.
Not missing, but for improvement.
For improve. Well,
regulatory maybe, yes.
I just think that I mean, off late, like I didn't have the time to get into that meritocracy and the arguments around it for Singapore. The care has to be taken to make sure that the goal does not become diluted to the point where it remains inaccessible only to for the majority of the population. Inclusion in terms of education, in terms of the investment. So one of the things that they did, at least in the formative years, all the way until the 90s and 2000s, was education was never out of reach for students. quality, high quality education, and whatever university I have in the country will be at least a good school. This is actually paraphrasing one of the professors in Lee Kuan Yew School. He's an expert in meritocracy, and if you read his work, he says, this is what I can guarantee, right? You will not be left behind because you come to school A or school B. There will be a common denominator. The quality is always maintained, and it'll never be out of reach for you in terms of affordability. If you don't have, I will subsidize scholarships, I will provide them for you, and you will get the benefit, right? So this eventually became a system where the focus then started moving away from equality of opportunity to a small elitist group who are driven by just the performance metrics and competitiveness metrics. That is what you don't want to happen in UAE. If you see the danger going in that direction, you want to take a step back. I'm not saying it is happening. I don't know enough about it or the data to say it. But if you see that could become one like that, that is a lesson that you can learn, saying that we should not do that. So you have to start fixing that issue if you see things going in that direction. But keep it, inclusivity is absolutely essential, and the right skill sets for the right kind of jobs. What is the point of studying and getting a good education when I can't find a relevant job in the particular society? You have to have an enabling job market, otherwise you're going to face underemployment, etc. in the society. So
great. I think we have run out of time. Dr. Sasi and Dr. Amani, thank you so much for your invaluable contribution this morning. It was extremely interesting. I would like to end off with a comment from Mr. Shabir Hassanbai, who is the former ambassador from Singapore to Nigeria, and he has a business here in the UAE, which this explains his interest and his love for the country. And when we came here from Singapore, he was an invaluable source of advice. And he said, beyond economic success of Singapore is the social integration and social mobility. Public housing is an example, and jobs in government, which I think coincides with a lot of what the two of you have had to say so far. I think at that note, I am going to ask our Dean, Professor Muhammad Mahdi, to end off our event. Professor, over to you. Thank you so much for your attendance as well.
thank you, Johan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Zaki Nusayba, UAE Chancellor, Vice Chancellor Ghalib, Provost Mohammed, colleagues, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming to this event. This event is a twofold. So, as you have seen, we started with the STEPS inaugural program about the UAE and Singapore, and the second part will be the inauguration of this venue by His Excellency, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank him for honoring this event with his patronage and his presence. Now, before I end my remarks, let me say something. As we talk about countries moving from the third world to the first world, I'd like to say something about the UAE. I came to this country over 30 years ago, and I can tell you that what I have seen and what I have witnessed during these years is really astonishing and aspiring. This country, in less than 50 years, has become a global transport hub, a luxury tourism destination, and an international financial center. This is just to name a few of the great achievements of the UAE. And so congratulations to this country on its 50th anniversary. And I hope other countries, other nations learn from this country's approach to growth and development. So whether you have joined us virtually or in person, I'd like to thank you very much for your presence and for your participation. And I hope to see you in our future steps, talks and seminars. And now I'd like to invite His Excellency to inaugurate and tour this venue. Thank you very much.